Going to record for you a short review of what should be what you learned in your anatomy and physiology classes. So we teach this in 108 here. Or if you took advanced physiology, this would be in the second part of that course. Just going through the review of the endocrine system. So this will take you up until slide 14. So then we can start with the disorders in class on Tuesday. So if we just go to slide 2, you're going through the minimum learning objectives, which are very specific, beginning with just understanding what's going on with hormones being released in the endocrine system. And then it's going to move through the different organs we'll be talking about. So we'll know about the thyroid and all of the different things that happen to the thyroid. So hypo, hyper, the causes of these diseases, what that person would look like clinically. And I'll mention a couple of ways we could treat those people. We'll move to the pancreas. We'll talk about diabetes, for example, at length. Then we'll move to the adrenal glands and understand all of those issues. So this is a chapter where we're not dealing with a ton of non-specific symptoms. Excuse me. So in this case, we'll deal with some pretty specific things that will help let you know what you're looking at. But one thing, if you've never really done a lot of endocrinology before, if you're really good at your feedback loops, that's really going to get you through a lot of this chapter. So what I always tell my students is to begin their exam by drawing the feedback loops for the HPA axis, for example, in the thyroid. And that will really help you understand a lot of the questions. Okay, so on slide 3, we are just outlining endocrine versus exocrine glands. So this is the endocrine chapter. So we're referring to all endocrine glands, and endocrine glands themselves don't have ducts. What that means is they'll all be heavily vascularized and secrete their products into the bloodstream. So this chapter is going to go through the adrenals, pituitary, and thyroid. So those things are all going to be associated with a pretty large blood supply. Whereas exocrine glands, they excrete products. And excretion means that we're going to have things released into the external environment through a duct system. Sweat glands, salivary glands, and mammary glands are all considered exocrine in nature. And then it'll get a little bit more complicated in the reproductive chapter, which we do after endocrine, because those can function as both. In the same way, the pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland, and we outline the exocrine functions in the last chapter. On slide 4, we are going through the basic glands in the endocrine system. So beginning with the pineal gland, we talk a little bit about that at the end of this lecture, but the pineal gland is what synthesizes melatonin. It lacks the blood-brain barrier that the rest of the brain has. There's about 5 distinct brain areas without the blood-brain barrier, and the pineal is one of them. And the pineal, when it makes melatonin, it does so in response to sunlight. Or more specifically, in the absence of sunlight. The suprachiasmatic nucleus sends a message to the pineal gland to help manufacture melatonin, which is one of the indolamines. The other one that you might know of indolamine is serotonin, but melatonin specifically binds to its receptors and makes you feel sleepy. Underneath that is the hypothalamus, and we refer to this as the master gland in the system. The hypothalamus is all about homeostasis, and when we talk about the endocrine system maintaining homeostasis, the hypothalamus has a really large role in that. And we'll see in a couple of slides that the hypothalamus does manufacture some of these endocrine signals, which it then delivers to the pituitary. And the pituitary and hypothalamus are directly related. The pituitary is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. So those two are really directly connected, both physically and through a blood portal system. Underneath that is the thyroid gland, and embedded within the thyroid are the 4 parathyroid glands, which are on the back of the thyroid. There are 4 of them, and they're responsible for maintaining blood levels of calcium. The thyroid, though, is mainly metabolic in nature, and you'll see these disorders really commonly are going to either be an increase or decrease in metabolism. Underneath that is the thymus. We don't talk a ton about the thymus, so that's the only time I will mention it today, actually. Underneath that are the adrenals. The adrenals there's 2 of them. They are on top of the kidneys. We refer to them as suprarenal. And even though there's 2, each adrenal itself is actually 2 distinct glands. The cortex and the medulla have totally different functions. And so when you histologically stain them, the tissue looks much different in the cortex and the medulla. So we do consider that 2 distinct different portions of the adrenal. Beneath the adrenal glands, we have the pancreas, and its endocrine functions are going to be mainly concerned with insulin and glucagon. And then beneath that are the ovaries and testes, the gonadal system. We will review that in much detail in the reproductive chapter. That makes up something called the HPG axis, which stands for hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Those three things are going to work together. And one thing I want to make clear is that when we have these large axis systems in the body, they all integrate with one another. So if there is an imbalance in one system, you will see that carried over to another system. So for example, an adrenal disease can sometimes cause issue with the thyroid. So just understand that these things are not islands, they're all functioning together within their own complicated axis network. All right, on slide 5, what you see is a typical cell signaling pathway, and this is the way that the family of peptide hormones binds and works in the body. Sometimes we call these amino acid-based hormones because that's what they're made out of. But peptide hormones are things that bind like a normal neurotransmitter or drug in that they bind to a receptor on the cell surface. So that's what you're seeing here in the simplest of senses. The hormone is binding to its receptor. There's some sort of intracellular signaling cascade which will cause a reaction in that cell. Maybe it will turn on the cell so that it starts synthesizing a hormone. It can turn off the cell so that we stop synthesizing a hormone. There's a lot of different actions, but the main difference between peptide hormones and steroid hormones, which are next, are that peptide hormones are water soluble, which means that they cannot penetrate the cell membrane. So therefore, they have to bind to a receptor at the cell surface to affect that cell. So that was your foreshadowing to slide 6, where you have steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are synthesized out of various alterations to cholesterol. Cholesterol is taken into specific cell regions via LDL receptors, and it's a process called receptor-mediated endocytosis. So like LDL is we consider it more liquid in nature, and receptor-mediated endocytosis is a form of pinocytosis, which is a way of bringing liquid into the cell. And in pinocytosis, LDL, for example, would bind to its receptors on the cell surface. An invagination will then be created where the receptor complex, once it's saturated with all the LDL, will be turned into a vesicle that's manufactured out of the cell membrane. And then from there, the LDL will be taken into the cell and then modified. You don't have to know the whole modification. This isn't biochemistry, but you'll see before it becomes any one of the steroid hormones, it first turns into something called pregnenolone. So you'll see that word over and over again. And pregnenolone can be modified into a variety of things. So progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, or cortisol. So your rule of thumb for where steroid hormones come from is the gonads or the adrenals. If they are manufactured anywhere else in the body, they're not steroid hormones. Those are the only cell types that can manufacture steroid hormones. So because steroid hormones are made out of cholesterol and the cell membrane is made out of phospholipids and cholesterol, steroid hormones are highly lipophilic, so they dissolve into fat. So in this case, we don't have the hormone binding on the cell surface. Rather, it goes inside of the cell because it can dissolve through the cell membrane. And its receptor is internal. It's within the cell. And when it binds, it forms a complex with that receptor and then translocates into the nucleus. And steroid hormones are going to affect that cell at the DNA level. So you usually have transcription, translation, and a new protein, or the turning off of a protein. And if you go to slide 7, you can see this in a more detailed fashion. So outside the cell, you have the steroid hormone. It's highly lipophilic, so it goes into the cell, and its receptor is in the cytoplasm, somewhere within the cell. In this picture, it's in the nucleus. No big deal. You just have to know that the steroid hormone is inside of the cell. The steroid hormone finds its receptor, and they are attracted to one another. They have a high affinity for one another based on their shape. And once they are together, they have a special name, which is receptor hormone complex. There are specific cells that bring them to where they're supposed to go. They're called chaperonin molecules. And so the chaperonin molecules will help guide the receptor hormone complex to its binding site, which is located on the DNA. So once we have the steroid binding, It will read the DNA, which is just a giant recipe book for all the proteins in the body, and it will pick the recipe that is needed, and it will start making that product. So we'll have transcription, translation, and a new protein. All right, so not only do we have things coming from the adrenals or the gonads being steroid hormones, but when you're giving a synthetic hormone, like cortisone, for example, a synthetic cortisol, those things would have the same action as well. So steroid hormones bind inside of a cell. They cause transcription, translation. One other difference that I should point out is that peptide hormones are not stable in stomach acid. So if you think of insulin, for example, you don't see people taking an insulin pill. Insulin could not withstand the acidic environment of the stomach. However, you could take a prednisone pill because prednisone is a steroid hormone. It's synthetic cortisol. So therefore, it can withstand stomach acid and cause the same sort of action that a normal hormone would, native hormone. Okay, slide 8 is just telling you that hormones are tissue specific. And at the simplest sense, that means if a tissue has a receptor for a hormone, then that hormone can bind there and have action. So some hormones are really, really specific. An example of one is ACTH, which binds to receptors on the adrenal gland and causes cortisol release. So in this picture, ACTH would be like the example of hormone 2. It only binds in this one tissue B in the picture. And that's the only place in the body that ACTH binds is on the adrenal glands. However, you have some hormones that are totally non-specific. They can bind in all sorts of tissue, like hormone 1 in this picture. So I mentioned cortisol. You could put cortisone cream, which is again synthetic cortisol, anywhere on the body and it's going to work. You can rub it on your face, you can put it in your eye, you can inhale it. Every single tissue has a glucocorticoid receptor. Most of the hormones that are made by the gonads are this way too. So if you think of the widespread action of testosterone, it binds all over the place. That doesn't mean that it has the same action in each tissue. So on the face, it would cause hair growth. In the larynx, it causes a deepening of the voice. In muscle, it causes protein deposition. So as long as there's a receptor there for the hormone, then that hormone can have action. But that's not indicative of what the effect will be. So just at the simplest level, some hormones are really highly specific, like ACTH. Some hormones are non-specific. They bind all over the place, like a glucocorticoid. Okay, on slide 9, you have your introduction to hypothalamic control. Whenever there's hypothalamic control, we refer to this more as an axis. And this is a large type of feedback to get the hormone produced. So the whole point here is that the hypothalamus, our master gland, does a lot of manufacturing of things. And in the case that we have one of these hormones that needs to be released by the body, the hypothalamus would get a message from the body that there is altered homeostasis. And in response to that, the hypothalamus will signal to the anterior pituitary. That's important. I'll mention that in a little bit. To the anterior pituitary to make another hormone. So it's also called hormone-induced hormone release. The hypothalamus makes a hormone. It binds to the anterior pituitary. And in response to that hormone release, the anterior pituitary makes another hormone. And that hormone will now act on whatever the target gland is. In this case, it could be the adrenal glands. It could be the thyroid, acts on a large axis like this. Or it could be the gonads. These things all function in this way. So in order to make cortisol, for example, the hypothalamus makes something called CRH, the corticotropin-releasing hormone. The anterior pituitary, in response, makes ACTH, which I mentioned before in my example, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's telling you exactly where it's working in the cortex of the adrenal glands. And whenever you hear that word tropic, that means growth-related or positive effect. So that means it's going to turn on some sort of response. And then ACTH will bind to the cortex of the adrenal glands, and you'll get the production of cortisol. And so when we say that something is under negative feedback, it means that when the level of the hormone goes back to what we consider homeostatic levels, there will be a feedback to the hypothalamus to shut off production. And the hypothalamus in response makes something called a release inhibiting hormone, which we'll see in a picture in a little bit. But a release inhibiting hormone is an antagonist that works on the anterior pituitary. And so that would bind to the anterior pituitary and shut off production. Okay, so those are a couple of axes, and this is just your example. You could fit thyroid hormone, cortisol, estrogen, testosterone. All of those things could fit into this picture with the negative feedback. And so each of the individual ones falls under the chapter heading for that organ and gland, but this is just an introduction here to negative feedback. So you only have negative feedback when we've reached normal levels, which means if you fail to reach normal levels, we'll just have more and more and more of that hormone being produced. Okay, slide 10 is showing you the communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Again, the pituitary is a physical extension of the hypothalamus. So in this picture, you can locate the hypothalamus, and it is going to produce this little stalk called the infundibulum. And that stalk goes then to two different pieces, an anterior and a posterior portion of the pituitary. The full name for the pituitary is the hypophysis. I don't know why they named it that, but they did. And so therefore, there are two different parts of it that you should know the names for if you're not familiar with them. The anterior portion is referred to as the adenohypophysis. And remember, adeno means gland. So the adenohypophysis, so that's saying the gland pituitary, is glandular tissue. There are glands there that can make hormone and secrete hormone. The posterior part of the pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. And neuro refers to neural tissue. It's tissue from the central nervous system. So the neurohypophysis is not glandular. It cannot manufacture its own hormones. Rather, it receives hormones from the hypothalamus. So in this case, the hypothalamus produces those hormones and then delivers them to the neurohypophysis through just these long axonal projections. And you can actually see that in the picture on the right side. On the top of that picture that says the pituitary glands, beneath that word, it says neurosecretory cells. Those are the cells in the hypothalamus that make these two products that are secreted by the neurohypophysis. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin come from those neurosecretory cells. So they're manufactured in the cells, and then they travel along down the cell bodies, down the axon, and they're stored at the end of those neurons, and they're released in exocytosis processes that you would see other places in the body. And then those are absorbed into the bloodstream after the pituitary. So you'll see that both of these areas are going to have a huge amount of veins associated with them that will either carry hormones from the front or back of the pituitary. So if you look at the front part of this picture with the vascularization there, we see that the anterior part of the pituitary is still an extension of the hypothalamus, but there's no direct neurons connecting it. Rather, the hypothalamus has to make a product, and it travels through a blood system, and it's referred to as the portal system, the hypophyseal portal system. And the hormone travels down this portal system to the active cells in the anterior pituitary, which will be stimulated by that hormone and then have an action. So just remember that the front part is glandular tissue. We get the manufacturing of hormones there. The posterior portion is just a storage site for things that are manufactured in the hypothalamus. One thing I want you to appreciate about this pituitary is that it is stuck. It is stuck in an area of the body called the sella turcica, and that is the little bony cup that it sits in at the base of the skull. I'm mentioning this because in cases of really, really bad head trauma, if somebody was in an accident, for example, at a really high speed, you can actually have so much movement in the brain that it would cause the either full or partial removal of the pituitary from the rest of the brain. So it's really important that people get some sort of scan to make sure that everything is still attached, because if you saw a hypofunction of a gland after an accident, that might be a plausible reason, is that it was physically disconnected, because that infundibulum is quite thin and easy to break. All right, slide 11 is a really important slide with every single thing that you kind of have to know in this chapter. So this is something that I would use to review for all of the different hormones. And so we'll begin at the top. We've got the hypothalamus, and again, that is directly going to deliver products to the posterior pituitary. So there's no in-between step there. It just sends these two products to the posterior pituitary, and they're stored there until there is a need for them to be released. Those two products are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And that's it. Those are the only two things that come from the posterior pituitary. And those don't have a specific site of action with regards to a gland. They act in larger places in the body. So oxytocin is really important in stimulating uterine contractions. That's how you deliver a fetus, so that's important. Also, you might have heard of synthetic oxytocin. It's called Pitocin. So Pitocin, if somebody's put on a Pitocin drip, it's to induce labor. So you're inducing uterine contractions. So that's important. And that's actually a positive feedback. So the more oxytocin you get, the harder the contractions are. And then the further the baby moves down and presses on the cervix. More pressing on the cervix equals more oxytocin. And this just happens until the baby is delivered. Oxytocin is also really important in what we call the milk ejection reflex. So we'll see in just a little bit that prolactin is what makes the milk. It stimulates the cells to make milk. Oxytocin is important for milk ejection. So remember, mammary glands are exocrine in nature. So as milk is produced, it's forced into a mammary duct. And that duct is lined with smooth muscle. And so when oxytocin is around, it stimulates contraction of the duct so that it starts the flow of milk. So prolactin and oxytocin go together really, really nicely. The second product is antidiuretic hormone. And if you get that mixed up, just remember diuresis means water loss or water production. So antidiuretic hormone means anti-water loss. We refer to it as our water-sparing hormone. So anytime the body is in a state of dehydration, we have ADH release, which will help us not pee out any excess water in the urine, and it will be retained. All right, so then if we move down to the anterior pituitary, that's all in pink. So remember, these aren't directly connected to one another through these axonal projections. So when we need an anterior pituitary hormone, we need to first have a product made by the hypothalamus. So this isn't that bad. Whatever the name of the hormone is, it comes before the word releasing hormones. So if we use the first example on the right, growth hormone, if the hypothalamus receives a signal from the body that there's more growth hormone needed, the hypothalamus makes growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. And so that's going to bind to receptors on the surface of the anterior pituitary. And in response to GHRH, we're going to get growth hormone production. Growth hormone is all over the place. It's really important for long bone growth, especially before puberty, because at puberty, the plates close, the growth plates, the epiphyseal plates. So therefore, the long bones can continue to grow until the plates are closed or fused. So that's really important before the plates close. After the plates close, growth hormone stimulates protein deposition. So we consider its actions anabolic, which is why people would take human growth hormone to get bigger muscles. And then the more muscles you have, the higher your metabolic rate and the faster you burn through calories and fat. Okay, if the body wanted, or not less, but we reached normal levels of growth hormone in the blood, then that would send a message back to the hypothalamus, which would make growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. And a release inhibiting hormone is an antagonist for the receptors on the anterior pituitary. So therefore, the pituitary won't make any more of that product. So I hope that makes sense. And whenever you see the words releasing hormones, that means that it came from the hypothalamus. And they're made anytime the hypothalamus is stimulated to make more of that product. All right, so we've got our releasing hormones, release inhibiting hormones, and we went through growth hormone, and the other ones underneath it, the reason they're in red is because they just go out to the bloodstream. They don't act on an intermediate gland. So for example, growth hormone works on muscles and bone. Prolactin, we already mentioned, is really important for milk production, but it also does things like breast differentiation. So it's important when a female first becomes pregnant, it helps stimulate hyperplasia of the breast tissue, so you get more what they're called mammotrophs. Remember, troph is growth. So you get more stimulation of cells that make milk. So that's important. Prolactin, whenever you see the word galactorrhea, that means improper lactation. So lactating when you're not supposed to. So galactorrhea is not normal in males. So that's usually hypersecretion of prolactin. Finally, there's melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and you'll see at the end there's some different disorders that will cause discoloration of the skin, and the reason for that is the anterior pituitary makes melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and that stimulates the melanocytes in your skin to make melanin, so that's going to change pigmentation. So you will see some brown blotchiness in different disorders. That's a overproduction of MSH. At the bottom, you have in green the hormones that work on intermediate glands. So first is the thyroid, and the thyroid, you get thyroid stimulating hormone production made by the anterior pituitary, and that's a really good name for that hormone because that's exactly what it does. It binds to its receptor on the cells of the thyroid, and it stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormones. So that's really important. Next, we have the adrenal glands. So in the case that we want the adrenal cortex to do something, the anterior pituitary makes ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, binds to cells on the adrenal cortex, and there's different products made by the cortex, but the main one that we think of with the cortex and causes the most symptoms when there's too much of it is cortisol. Cortisol we call the stress hormone, and the reason for that is it is released in long-term stress. So not just I jumped out from behind a bookshelf and scared you, that's all catecholamine release. And that's important because cortisol, after about 3 days of chronic stress, starts to be released. And that is going to actually increase tissue permeability to catecholamines. So dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, so that you can continue to have a sympathetic response. So cortisol is the main product of the cortex. The final thing on the slide are the gonadal hormones, which again, we're going to go over in the reproductive chapter in length. They are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which in males obviously act in the testes, and in females act on the ovaries. And we're going to learn all of those things later. So this is your slide you need to know the most about. Please know these hormones. Okay, and then on slide 12, I have some examples of how you can start to fill in these little feedback loops for things. So on the left, you just have your blank negative feedback loop. So the hypothalamus is making a releasing hormone, a release inhibiting hormone, which will either turn on or off the anterior pituitary. And on the right, it's filled in. So we're using growth hormone here. So the hypothalamus would make growth hormone releasing hormone to get growth hormone release, or it would make growth hormone release inhibiting hormone to stop growth hormone production. Yeah, and if you understand this, then that's good. You'll understand a lot of the blood tests that we'll look at. All right, so I said we go up to slide 14, but that's probably where we'll start in class, because this slide 13 says endocrine dysfunction, which is what we're going to talk about in class. So if you have any questions about what I talked about, if it doesn't make any sense, if you don't remember this from when you took it the first time and you have more questions, please come see me. Otherwise, we will be ready to start with slide 14 in class. All right, bye.